Hello everybody. Today we are going to discuss Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak is an Indian literary theorist and feminist critic. She was born in 1942 in Kolkata, India. Now she is a professor at Columbia University and a founding member of Columbia Institute for Comparative Literature and Society. Chakravorty is famous for her translation of Off Grammatology by Jacques Derrida, and her major works are In the Other Worlds 1987, Can the Subaltern Speak 1988, A Critique of Postcolonial Reason 1999. Can the Subaltern Speak is her famous essay in which she discussing marginalized people can truly have their voices heard within dominant power structures. In other words, it is a collection of the essay on feminism, postcolonialism and deconstructions. And A Critique of Postcolonial Reason, it is her theoretical work which is examine how Western philosophy and literature represents colonized people. So let's discuss in a very detail her essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? This essay is a foundational text in postcolonial studies and feminist theory. The term subaltern is not coined by the Spivak, but it is originally comes from the writings of the Antonio Gramsci. So the title of the particular essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? It is a very provocative question, where Spivak answer is a very complex. She doesn't mean that marginalized people are physically unable to speak, but rather she argues that when subaltern people try to express themselves, their voice are often ignored or distorted or just translated or appropriated by powerful institutions. So as a result, they cannot be heard in their own terms. Now, Spivak's biggest argument is against Western intellectuals, big thinkers from Europe and America who thought they were doing a good thing by giving voice to oppressed people. But she says that these thinkers, even though their intentions were good, were actually speaking on the behalf of oppressed without really understanding their lives. They were putting their own ideas and assumptions onto these people. Spivak says this is actually a new form of colonialism. Instead of ruling people physically, you are now ruling their narrative and their story. She also says that women among the subaltern are in a worse situation. They were oppressed from two sides at the same time, from the Western world that looks down on them and from the men within their own community and society. So they are silenced doubly. To explain her point, she gives a very powerful example from Indian history, the practice of a sati, where widow was expected to burn herself on her husband's funeral pyre. When the British colonial rulers saw this, they said, we must save these poor Indian women from this cruel Indian men. And on the other side, Indian nationalist men said, this is our glorious tradition and the British have no rights to interfere. Notice one thing. In this whole debate between British and Indian men, nobody once sat down and asked the woman herself what she wanted. Her voice was completely missing. Both sides were using her life and her body to fight their own political battle. This is exactly point Spivak is making when she says the subaltern cannot speak. She does not mean that oppressed people have no mouth or no words. She means that even when they speak, this system does not listen. There are nobody in power who genuinely willing to hear them and take their words seriously. Speaking only words when there is someone ready to listen, and that listener simply does not exist for the subaltern. So in this essay, Spivak starts her essay by criticizing these two thinkers, Foucault and Deleuze, in one of their conversations. Foucault and Deleuze were saying that intellectuals should step back and just let the oppressed people speak for themselves. They believed the marginalized already know their own situation and just need a platform. Spivak says this sounds very nice, but it is actually quite naive and even dishonest. She argues that these two Western men sitting in their comfortable position of power and privilege, we are not realizing how deeply their own thinking was shaped by Western assumptions. By saying, let them speak, without actually dismantling the power structure. They were still controlling the narrative without admitting it. So she uses them as an example of how even the most progressive Western intellectuals can unknowingly reproduce colonial thinking. Spivak also discusses her very personal and emotional about Bhuvneshwari Bhaduri or Bahaduri was a young Bengali woman who was involved in the Indian armed struggle for independence. In 1926, she was given the task of carrying out a political assassination, but she could not bring herself to do it. She was so troubled by this and that she decided to take her own life. But before doing so, she waited until she got her period. She did this deliberately so that people would not assume she had killed herself because of an illegitimate pregnancy, which was the most common assumption people made when a young unmarried woman died. She was trying to communicate something through her death, trying to leave a message with her own body that this was a political act and not a matter of a shame or dishonor. But what actually happened? Her own family and community completely ignored this message. Years later, her relative simply dismissed her death as something related to an illicit love affair. Nobody read the meaning she had carefully tried to write with her own body. Spivak uses this tragic example to show that even when the subaltern woman tries very hard to speak, even when she uses the only means available to her, society still refuses to listen and instead feeds her story into a convenient and familiar narrative. So this is example hits very hard because it shows the complete failure of the system to hear a woman's voice even in her most desperate, deliberate act of communication. So these were the very central argument of this essay. In this essay, she has discussed many concepts like subaltern and strategic essentialism and epistemic violence. So, strategic essentialism is a temporary collective identity adopted for political action, and epistemic violence is the silencing or misrepresentation of a marginalized voices through dominant knowledge system. So, this is about Spivak's post-colonial feminist theory. So, thank you so much, and comment down anything you wanted to discuss in this lecture or essay. Thank you.